Good morning.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing all right. Just finishing the last of my eggs.
Okay, breakfast time, dinner time for Tim. Hey Tim, hey Chris.
Morning.
I double, yeah.
Dinner? What's that? I can't afford these diet drugs that make you go all skinny and poppy. Dinner? What's that?
What? I'm gonna just start eating sardines. I'm gonna go on the
Have a
sardine.
pickle.
Apparently, there's a claim that's been made that that eating only sardines will get you into ketosis faster than water fasting. But I don't know. I tried it.
Well, in your time zone, you're past 11s, so it's too late.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Oh, wait a minute. Let me turn off my little device.
So it's just after 7 p.m.
Sorry about that.
It's, you look
Automatic,
strangely artificial, Chris.
automated processes. So we're panning all around my room. Apparently, yes, I still haven't found the the control for that, but I don't know. I guess I'll just learn to live with it.
Well, the answer to that is RFTM.
Hmm? I'm sorry? Let me turn up the volume a little bit. I didn't catch that.
Weird.
Read the fucking manual.
Oh, RTFM. Right. Yes, that used to be the tech
Before I
support
forget,
go-to. Yeah, right. Because
before we go off on
nobody ever does. Yeah.
tangent,
That
this is
where
a
is the
I
manual
think
buried though,
this
is the
section
question.
to read is a Great West Wing episode.
Is there
I
a West Wing RTFM? Yeah, I suppose there would have to be, wouldn't there? So
and
Chris,
with
you had a background
various other things
minute.
around the world.
Oh, it was,
I had reason elsewhere to quote Percy Fitzwallace.
Ah,
But what do I know about warfare?
oops, what happened? Oh, I'm on the wrong keyboard.
yeah, I was working on a project earlier in the week that involved me taking a screen capture of Fletch's apartment from the
Ooh,
1985
Oh,
movie.
right. For your
cool.
blog. I was wondering. I just glanced at it. Yeah, it's similar to the yeah. There's the typewriter. It's similar to the Lego one that you posted the other day too, though.
Yeah. Well, so it started really, I and I think I may have killed him by thinking about him, but I was thinking about the Royal HH typewriter in All the President's Men
Mm.
that was at Carl Bernstein's house, and they used it to type because they were worried they were being surveilled or bugged, and
Mm,
typing on a typewriter was a way
mhm,
around it.
sure.
And then I remembered there was this one on Fletch's desk in his apartment, which
Mm.
interestingly has a bumper sticker that says police on the side,
Oh wow. Yep.
which is hilarious given the police brutality he underwent in the movie.
Hmm.
And then he had the same typewriter at work. Meanwhile, the guy beside him, the hapless guy who wanted his job, um, was typing on a crappier Underwood 5, I think.
Mm,
So, I don't know. It was a quirky project for the week.
yeah. Yeah. So
Chris, have you been to, there's a typewriter repair store in San Francisco, or at least there was about 8 years ago or so, that had been around for decades.
California typewriter or Berkeley typewriter.
It was in
There's
San Francisco.
there's kind of two famous ones. They actually made a documentary about California typewriter in 2016-ish.
mm,
Yeah, I think
Um,
that's the one.
and then
Because it
I
was,
think it has since shut down, and the guy who was there left and went to Berkeley
okay.
typewriter. Although he's got to be in his late 60s, early 70s. So, but I've seen in the last year, probably three typewriter shops open up,
Hmm.
Wow.
at
Cool.
least maybe four. So there are people who are dying and retiring out of it, but there's enough demand that. And the one guy who just opened a storefront in Chicago in the last year, he's got a list like 80 people deep.
Wow.
If you want
Hmm.
him to work on and repair your machine,
Cool.
he's he's already booked through the end of the year and into next year, I think.
Hmm.
So bizarre.
Interesting. You're bringing it back.
So, well, you got to keep these siren servers at bay. So, what are
Yep.
you gonna do?
Yeah, and you
You gotta
gotta be ready
keep
for when
paper.
your machine stops too.
You gotta keep paper databases so that, if they want to spy over your shoulder, they gotta actually come and see your shoulder.
Right. Right. Exactly. At least make them work for it. Yeah. So I've been going through my backup, and I had to
Hmm.
get a little dongle to make my backup connect to my current computers. And I just downloaded Scrivener again because
Huh.
a lot of my journals and notes that I made and daily notes and stuff that I made in a decade ago in the 2011 to 2014 time range were all in Scrivener. So I thought I will go back and kind of look through those and do a little bit of that.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah. Use.
I don't know where it's going to end up, if it's going to, if any of it's going to find its way to, to anything um, out in the world or just be fuel for, my own kind of thinking. Well, I'm sorry, I cut you off there, Thomas.
No, I was just gonna say I have a strong affinity for Scrivener, but it didn't work with my workflow
Yeah,
over time. And
I
and I
wish
had
it
stumbled
would too.
across I had stumbled across oddities in my blog, and that were just from about sort of that same period, sort of like 2010, 2013, and part of it was the process of getting things writing out of Scrivener and then into my blog. And it was a three-step process to do that. And it was just painful and then just went straight to full markdown. But I've got things, have been sort of in a slow process over the last few years of getting things out of Scrivener and into just pure markdown.
Mhm.
And that pure markdown is sometimes it has quirks,
Yeah.
I'll say. And then also getting things out of Ulysses, because that's sort of a bound system as well. And I was just like, I know I wrote this, but it was like just getting everything into fully plain markdown, which is kind of what I started doing in 2010, 2011, largely because my parents had just passed within 11 months of each other and went out. My mom was the last to go, went out to California. And as I got out there, my hard drive on my laptop died. And I was just like, crud, I can get a replacement hard drive. And I had my backup drive with me, which is a little unwieldy going to lawyers, banks, all sorts of stuff. So I'm just like,
Mhm.
picked up an iPad, which was second version. And I'm like, okay, I can take this around everywhere. And if I work in Markdown, it will work across everything
Mhm.
and be stable. And I had somewhat started shifting my notes in like 2009 to 2010 fully into Markdown. But it was just like, okay. And it was kind of why I thought I liked Ulysses because it was Markdown, but it's just all in its structure. And I'm like, that's kind of goes against the purpose.
Yeah. 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 It's weird because I was going from and actually I've got so much on this thing that it's like some of the stuff is Pages as well. So
Hmm.
thankfully Pages still
Yeah.
works and Apple
Yeah. It,
supports it.
yeah.
So there's that. But also, yeah, I would go from Scrivener into and for some reason I saved a bunch of Rapid Weaver,
Mm.
because
Hmm.
that's what I actually, built. my own website on, and when I was managing my own domains and stuff. And yeah, and so there's a lot of duplication on there
Yeah.
of stuff, and it's sort of like I'm looking for um yeah, and I don't know I don't know where it's going to go.
Hmm.
I do think that, I've sort of, started this project on just kind of this week on a Substack where I'm going to actually kind of think out
Where,
loud about religion and American
so
politics.
that context,
I'm
Hmm.
sorry,
so that context, where's all the peppermint tea stuff?
the peppermint stuff is all, yeah, that's all in here too.
The raw nuts.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's in there too. That was some of it. Some of that was in Tinderbox as well. I would
Hmm.
trans. I was actually making little cards in Tinderbox and transcribing letters that I was reading in the archives into that. So yeah, so there's that too. I suppose at some point, if I really wanted to access that, I would have to.
But
I think Eastgate still exists
you've
too.
got Tinderbox
Hmm.
with all the cards, and you've got Scrivener with the words.
Well, I've
So
got
you would have exported.
a lot of that yeah, all of the stuff that I actually used, I went, back in the, 2014 to 2017, time range. I took all of that stuff from Tinderbox and I put it in Scrivener and I made a card for each one. I loved the idea of that cork board. It's too bad it wasn't a little bit more
Hmm.
flowing and, and less structured itself, and, and more
Hmm.
amenable to kind of bidirectional linking. That would have been really sort
Yeah.
of ideal. But yeah, so
Well,
this week I
that,
decided I would, because I've also got, tons and tons of notes and readings that I did on, American cultural history, especially
Hmm.
because I was always very interested in, sort of the Thomas Paine tradition and how that flowed through,
Hmm.
how it flowed back to London, to Richard Carlile, and then, George Jacob Holyoake and Charles Bradlaugh and those types of people. But then also the way it, kind of continued in America with Robert Owen and Robert Dale Owen and Francis Wright and Charles Knowlton and,
you must have had a huge crime forward almost, as you now see it often in the TV or the film programs of all these individual people, and they're all joined up with red tape or whatever. And the only thing when I was looking at it, I'm beginning to uh, write stuff of more than a dozen tweets at a go. I looked at Scrivener, and when the cork bold came up as being as you worked your way through that bit of software and coming, never having been a Mac person, even though I've had an iPhone and an iPad, I've never really been a Mac PC laptop or desktop or anything like that. In spite of the fact that Intel has never been a client that Apple has. I saw the cork board and thought, oh great, just what? But
right. Yeah.
it's so big. It's only so big, and it's like, wait a minute, I've got 250 people in this event. How do I get them all in?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I had to, so I had to revert back to using the wall of the office and preempting their post-its.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and
So
yeah, and
way back
it was
when
only it was
1993, yeah.
bounded and it was only two dimensional, and yeah,
Hmm.
Yeah. That's the other problem is obviously because it's so small, you can say, okay, let's put the head name of each subgroup
mhm,
and then stack the other personalities below. If you go 3D, it's not too bad because you've got like 36 cards on the front or something,
mhm.
24,
Right.
36, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
It's not until you get to doing Lord of the Rings or something that you want to, you need a bigger cast
Yeah.
um, War and Peace or something. But,
Excuse me.
but even with 24 clans or 36 tribes or whatever,
Hmm.
it's still a limit. And
Yeah. I just downloaded the latest version, and I
much as
wonder
I
if,
like
I wonder if maybe they've
now like Obsidian version
done anything with.
uh, Scrivener, my limitation is how much can I stick on the screen?
Hmm.
And more importantly, how much can I stick on the screen in an almost canvas-like way, i.e. the corkboard of Scrivener equivalent, but also still read the damn stuff, even if it's just the headline name and the headline initials.
Hmm.
Even if you went down to initials, there's enough JFKs going around to make it useful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's then that I think of uh, Tom Cruise in the Minority Report moving the virtual desktop around. I thought,
Yeah.
well, a bit like, yeah, there's even a quote from John Spencer playing Leo McGarry in the West Wing saying, "Where's my jet car? Where's my
Right.
where, you know, that Minority Report scene? You almost got now because you've got the big wall mounted or the big desk mounted 40 plus inch screens that are touch screens.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, but then you can't see it when I'm doing. All you think is he's not waving the flags in the right order.
Semaphore. Yeah.
It,
As in, send the message Nelson way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
it's like
there's also
it,
there's
here,
a nice scene in the first Avatar, right, where they've got those translucent screens and they're throwing data from their handheld devices onto the big screen and stuff, and they sort of pick that idea
but
of the workflow up
those
and put it. I think
transparent
that
white
also finds
screens
its way into The Expanse.
in Hollywood films. I mean, you even get them in James Bond, at least the last few that Daniel Craig is in. You get somebody walk up to a table that other people are talking about, and he's like a card, like a playing card deck, and there's all these pages written across the table electronically.
Hmm.
But it's uh,
Yeah.
here, for instance, they've just refilled the dancing fountain lake because they've been repairing the lake after like 15 years of use. And they whenever they do serious work, they put a wall up, a temporary wall, so you can't see them working too easily.
Mm.
But they're still doing all the light show up and down the Burj Khalifa. So there's still a crowd out.
Hmm.
There's some complaints. So they then made the whole of the fence an LCD screen.
Hmm.
So you had this LCD screen that was about a kilometre and a half long, but it did various dancey waves relatively simplistically, but it did a bit of dancey waves. So there's people standing by the fence, which is like 15 foot tall, having their photograph taken against the LCD screen.
Hmm.
And it's like, there's the Burj Khalifa there. You're taking the photograph too close. You can't see it.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
um,
Dan, coming back to your religion and politics, and it also sort of ties to the book because there was a piece where Lanier was talking about religion, and and it had me thinking about just sort of the something that I had said last week, which was wealth wanders,
Hmm.
and looking at sort of the political state in the US, some of the really bizarre things that are happening from the edges because they don't make economic sense.
Hmm.
It goes completely against stuff that you would learn in a brushstroke middle school economics overview.
Sure.
But there's essentially the high level sort of billionaire backers um, are not the ones who are making money to reinvest in the US. They don't are not reinvesting in the US. They are reinvesting elsewhere.
Uh-huh.
And there is also sort of a sort of slicing Christianity as they wish and cutting things out. And it is very close to what there's a group in Arlington called the Family or the Fellowship. And there's a Netscape documentary on them. And I knew them really well. Right after grad school, I was living in Arlington, working at a Starbucks that was down the hill from them, and got to know a lot of them really well and go hang out with them
Uh-huh.
because there was an awful lot of interesting technology pieces doing it. Um, and they had sort of carved out the pieces that were uncomfortable for them from Christian doctrine
Uh-huh.
in really funny ways.
Uh-huh.
Just it was sort of head scratching. And the Netflix documentary does a really good job in sort of walking through and explaining it.
Uh-huh.
But an awful lot of sort of what the within the last like 2 or 3 weeks, there's been an awful lot of technology and Christianity, and it's like the new thing, and it has those exact same carve outs.
Uh-huh.
And sort of the Peter Thielism version, and he has the exact same carve outs
Uh-huh.
because they are, and there it's large chunks, and a lot of it is sort of the compassionate
Uh-huh.
and the things that sort of separate Christianity from other things that were prior.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so it's just, and reading sort of Lanier's piece, I'm like, that light bulb sort of went off this morning.
Uh-huh.
Again, I'm just like, it was just like critical. I'm like, there is something here. And I don't know what the connection is between like the family. Um, it was on 24th Street, and sometimes it's called the 24th Street Gang.
Uh-huh.
It's also sometimes called the Fellowship. They ran the National Prayer Breakfast. Um,
Okay.
but it's an interesting thing to sort of think about because there's an awful lot of a lot of the framing within sort of like the Christian nationalists
Uh-huh.
have that exact same carve out because it doesn't look like Christianity to an awful lot of folks who are Christian, but it's sort of something that comes from evangelical and just sort of like, oh, here are things that go against what we want to do to accrete power
Uh-huh.
and to take things over. It
Right.
goes against this stuff.
Yeah.
And so they just
How
carve it
do you
out.
accommodate all of that and put
Yeah.
those pieces
They're like,
together? Yeah.
yeah, how do we get power? How do we run everything in our own sort of small world view?
Uh-huh.
Because this other stuff is just very uncomfortable for
Yeah.
that. And so they just
Uh-huh.
don't talk about it, don't bring it up.
That's really interesting. I was thinking in the context of also that sort of what grew into today's libertarianism, right? That sort of made its
Hmm.
way through,
Yeah.
Austrian economics into, the
Yep.
stuff that we've talked about in previous, by talking about previous books, the Mont Pelerin Society and all of those things. The one that I'm much more familiar with is FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. Oh, thanks, Chris. I'll look at that. I haven't looked at
Hmm.
that. Which had, which I went to, they gave me a fellowship in like
Huh.
1982 or something to go down there for one of their summer sessions while I was an undergrad. And I had just like in the summer of 81, I had read Atlas Shrugged. So I
Mm.
was on it, I was like, and so and then I read, and then I subscribed to the Objectivist, and I became, I became an acolyte, and I read, The Virtue of Selfishness, and all of that stuff, and and all of I read it, I read everything, I just grabbed hold of everything, and I had, so I was arguing at the time against, some of I mean, this was at a time when, the people who had started FEE, like Leonard Read, were just barely still alive. and Percy
Hmm.
Gray and people like that. And but they had a younger guy who lived in Westchester County who was their economist,
Hmm.
young rich guy from Chicago, I think, of course. And then
Hmm.
they had a minister, and I was a real thorn in his side because I kept jumping up every time he would say that you can't have, morality without a foundation of faith. And that's the thing that I've been hearing lately this last week, especially from these conservative news people or
Hmm.
commentators or influencers or pundits or whatever, everybody on that side. There's one, yeah, and I'm conflicted about how deeply to sort of dig into responding to that stuff before I kind of create some type of a foundation of,
Hmm.
well, this is what because people like, for example, I think Tucker was at Turning Point on Friday, right? And did
Hmm.
and did they're continuing the Charlie Kirk show with guest
Hmm.
hosts. And so Tucker, kind of closed out the week. And he went off and he had the guy, what's his name? Glenn Hurley or something like that, that who was
Okay.
sort of Charlie's pastor on. And
Hmm.
he's a kind of a
Hmm.
polemicist. And Megyn Kelly interviewed him, because he was there. He was, he was right that, he was 25 feet from Kirk when he was shot, and he was in
Hmm.
the SUV that took him to the hospital and all of that. But their contention basically was that you can't have morality without religion. And the thing that they especially, like an hour and 18 minutes into this thing, they turn in this direction, and they basically, their thesis was that evil proves the existence of God. Because you can't even know what evil is unless you know what good is, and good equals God. And so QED, right? And
Yeah.
and so it's
Well,
that, like,
so
never does the hand leave the wrist. And
how,
and
how do
That
you
feels.
get Plato and Socrates, who no one ever speaks of what religion were they, yet
Yeah.
they all talked about philosophy and
Yeah.
morality and how to live a good life without any of the cruft of religion sneaking in,
yeah. Yeah, well,
So
Dante has them in hell, right? But they're in, aren't they all in hell? But they're in a kind of
Yeah.
a
yeah.
less obnoxious. They're in one of the upper circles or something.
Well,
Yep.
the thing that strikes me too is particularly as it relates to all of these kind of political things that we talk about and this siren server topic here
Hmm.
is so Charlie Kirk's wife, ostensibly in heavy mourning because her husband was just shot and killed on
Yeah,
television in live streaming.
yeah.
Yet, because of the siren song of the server, within days, she has pivoted. I am now the CEO of this company,
Mhm.
and we're gonna podcast out holy hell this week because this is where all the attention is.
Yeah.
And I got to get the eyeballs, I got to get the attention
Hmm.
going forward. Ostensibly, one would think so she can continue to support her family
Well, and
and
lock them
remain
down, yeah, because this
and
is
remain culturally and politically relevant. But the issue is she doesn't own the Siren server. So yes, she may see a huge bump in numbers, last week, this week, and maybe next week. But where does that go from here if she doesn't continue to, so which Siren server is really benefiting from all of the attention
Mhm.
that's going on here?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It is. I mean, it does really sort of. It'll be an interesting, kind of case study in who, what's tail and what's dog, right?
yeah.
And
Hmm.
and
Or
who,
cui bono,
right? Well, and who actually controls, is it really the technology that affords the connection, or and I suspect that probably what'll happen is, if unless they screw it up, that they will be able, by way of the message that they create around this, turn this into a, a kind of a turning, I mean, of what the thing was always called, a turning point, right? That, that this is a pivot, an event that, that culture could pivot on. It'll be interesting to see that the thing that it has, I guess, you know, it was easy years ago to just sort of make fun of televangelists, right? And, and the ways that they manipulated politicians with contributions and stuff like that, and the corruption and the, and the televangelists were often very corrupt themselves and venal, and so, they sort of,
Well, that's what
and the
I've been
things.
kind of I've been looking at too as he's describing and defining what a siren server is and how it works. It is, and in his conceptualization, it is something that's instantiated in a computer networked environment. But I think based on his definition, if you take out the computing piece, there have been, and he kind of touches on it, or at least makes me presume that he is touching on it for a reason, but when he mentions some of the religion pieces, or you say specifically televangelists,
Uh-huh.
in a television networked sense, before computers were an everyday thing and everyone was on them, televangelists were using that platform and creating their own siren server within the field of religion to get
Yep.
eyeballs and get attention and get flows of money and power that
Hmm.
allowed them to do other things. So, in some sense, televangelists were early versions, or even the Catholic Church, if you want to go back,
Yeah,
to 2000 years roughly,
absolutely.
or at least to second, third, fourth century AD, they were consolidating that power.
Uh-huh.
And the government, the Roman government, decided, hey, this religion thing could be useful as a tool. So, I'm going to show up at the Council of Nicaea and it's going to be the
Right.
version I
Put my
think.
thumb on the scale.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I'm
right,
going to put my
right.
thumb on the scale.
Yep,
We'll figure
yep.
it out, and it's going to be, Constantine is going to take over here to
Uh-huh.
some extent.
Yep,
But that becomes an early version of Siren Server.
right, right. And I think that's an
How
important point. Just that in and of itself is that a lot of what Lanier is talking about, I think, is the automation of processes that
Hmm.
already existed in the analog world, right? Which,
Yeah.
which is a theme, I guess, that that has emerged from a lot of the things, a lot of the books that we've talked about over time too, right? That a lot of what we're, of what we're dealing with in a lot of these cases, which realistically, I mean, so there's this automation of the analog process. Yeah, the church is, I think, a great example of that, of having been a siren server. I was before, just before you mentioned the church, Chris, I had written down lack of effort, right?
Mm.
And that seems to me another, I mean, it's a uncharitable way, I guess, of thinking of, why siren servers work, right? Because we don't want to go, we don't want to go through the process of thinking through, this stuff. And that's the way that, and that's the way that I guess religion works to an extent as well, right?
well, and if
That
you look
Hmm.
at
provides an answer that that we don't have to work out for ourselves.
and if you look at the small amounts of people get something out of religion, they get something out of the community of going to church,
Uh-huh.
doing the thing. So even particularly the early Catholic Church, if you were a widow or a
Mm.
child or someone who was sick,
Uh-huh.
the church would send somebody and they would take care of you. And it was a very early form of health care,
Absolutely.
especially for the super marginalized. And that's
Uh-huh.
what helped them kind of set up and get going.
Uh-huh.
But the amount of work that the church puts into it is very marginal. All the heavy lifting comes from the individuals who are members, which is
Yes.
where you get those, so the church is essentially aggregating a lot of the direct immediate value, while only providing small marginal value to the individual, which
Hmm.
is really what siren servers are doing. So
Mhm.
Facebook is accumulating massive
Absolutely. And
amounts of
getting credit
wealth
for it. Right.
and getting all the credit when it's really all us, the people, the humanity, which I'm still I haven't gotten to the part where he starts unraveling how do we fix all this and
Hmm.
bring it
Right.
back to a more human level, which I'm super fascinated to get to, but I'm also, I'm still picking apart and it's going to take the better part of a year because a lot of the stuff he talks about dovetails with a lot of reading I've done in information theory
Uh-huh.
and where does value adhere. So, I was super thrilled to see him make a tangential reference to uh, W. Brian Arthur, who is a huge in the economics and complexity space and
Uh-huh.
applying information theory to economics in some sense.
Uh-huh.
'Cause I think there's a lot of hand waving he does, especially in this week's reading, the chapter 12 through like 16, 17 space,
Uh-huh.
um,
Yeah.
about where the value adheres or who's creating the value, where is it going,
Uh-huh.
and why are we as individuals ignoring the value we bring to the table,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
or how is that being normalized such
Uh-huh.
that, or even in the right wing American, there's the right wing, there's religion, there's power, there's culture, and all those things have kind of come together in one big force to give the right a huge
Uh-huh.
amount of power right now.
Yeah.
But eventually they're going to screw something up, and unless they can have a siren server that keeps it all together, which right now one could say Donald J. Trump is the siren server of attention who's drawing all the value to do what he's doing. But what happens if he dies, what happens to all that power? It's going to split up amongst 50 other people because there is no,
Uh-huh.
simple heir apparent
Right.
who,
Right. Well, and,
no,
and also there's change over time as well, right? Because Chris, you were talking about the church in the third century or fourth century, right?
yeah,
And I was thinking of the church just before the French Revolution, right? Because I
yeah,
responded to a thing that Megan Kelly had said about, how the French Revolution, and the Jacobins and this horrible, beginning of wokeism, that she was kind of sketching out. And it was and my objection kind of was how rough a sketch it was. But also, that's a moment at which, the French church, I mean, the Avignon papacy, I mean, this whole
yeah,
history through medieval Europe, of power, right? And, and of sort of building all of these tools of power that for the longest time were perfectly aligned with the monarchy in France. But then, on whatever it was, June 17th or June 19th, when they threw in with the National Assembly, right? And the people and the revolution began. Then ironically, the Jacobins recognized that, oh shit, these people can't be trusted. They just they just betrayed the King of France. We cannot leave them, any scrap of power that they could use to do this again to us. So the whole French Revolution element is kind of I mean is kind of maybe an example of what happens when siren servers are pitted against each other, right? Because we're talking about
Hmm.
it in the news right now. We're talking about, the Larry Ellison empire getting hold of TikTok, right? And people are saying, well, at least that means that, that Zuckerberg didn't get it.
Well, I was thinking, particularly when we were back with the starter church, rolled it forward a little bit, relatively, sort of mid 1500s. And that was when, in English at least, they finally lost the battle to keep the Bible in Latin.
Yeah.
What I'm not sure about is when did the Bible get into French? to support a piece that we've just done. But of course,
That
back
would
in
have
that
had to
period,
have been Calvin, wouldn't it? 1530 after 1530.
Hmm.
what? Yeah, but Henry VIII,
Well, Tyndale already
prior
had done it,
to
right?
well, Henry VIII was still torturing people, saying, "Where did you get your Bible in English from?"
Hmm.
Including the last woman to be whacked in the Tower, whose name escapes me, but Asquith, something Asquith. Um, and that was also, of course, Henry kept on flip-flopping between Catholic and Protestant backwards and forwards, which didn't help the stability of Britain, stroke England at that.
Hmm.
But of course, in that period from like 250, 300 to like 15, 1600, the monarch's word was law in that context. And if you weren't in his religion, or at least his branch of religion, even though obviously often that was often a semi-automatic death sentence, which may not have always happened, but it happened often enough for it to be a tangible risk. But within the siren servers argument, and he was talking about it, I think it was around chapter 12, 13. The one thing he doesn't talk about, or if he did, I missed it, is all in the digital world. And one of the things that's gone particularly more digital than it was when he wrote the book, which was only 10 years ago, is of course things like academic papers. You know, 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, you really needed a physical copy because there wasn't that many. But, so I thought, oh, I wonder what's the rough proportion that are open access and pay for subscriptions, and how many uh, siren servers do we have? So as you do, you ask whichever flavor of ChatGPT you like, what's the market? Because you know, I'm not in marketing field, so I don't have a predisposed website to look at.
Hmm.
And the top five big academic papers, deliberately didn't ask scientific. I asked across the board, so history, literature, science, medicine, etc. And the top five are a slight spread between like 5% and 20% margin. Uh, and that doesn't seem to be changing. So there's an element of a world that has gone digital and now gives you therefore much improved access because, sorry, but I don't need to use a science citation index anymore. I've got Research Rabbit. I've got
Hmm.
even Google Scholar would be better than what I had when I was at university.
Hmm.
It wouldn't take me a week to find 50 papers that were applicable. It takes me like 5 minutes. Uh,
Well, it sort
that's
of
the
muddies the
bullshit.
water of the sort of conspiracy theory, so-called story of Robert Maxwell and the consolidation of academic publishing, which, if all of that has ceased to be an issue anymore, then it's gonna make it more difficult for people to recognize, if it was an issue in the past.
Well,
Those,
when you
all those
when
people, there's like 30 odd percent papers are now open access from the
Hmm.
get go. So that has broken the siren server's model that he's talking about. So I then thought, okay, what's the picture if you flip it to being non-fiction books? And although the names change, the pattern's almost identical from a worldwide perspective. You know, penguin India and penguin Australia and penguin US and penguin UK still produce about 20-25% of all the titles. The only thing I then asked a question in terms of the chat with the chat bot was, are there anybody declaring, because obviously books don't have quite the same citation metrics, etc., with them in the same way.
Uh-huh.
So that doesn't really, the fact that there's a review or no review or whatever is relatively insignificant compared to the way that the academic papers are plus used and given some sort of weight. So I thought, what's the other interesting question? Which publishers and what are the answer? What is the rough numbers from those answers that declare debut versus repeat author? And there doesn't seem to be a good answer because there's not enough declaration from the publishers saying, oh, here's a debut book in the non-fiction world. In the fiction world, I don't think it's quite the same because a debut publisher, a debut author has a big uh, selling point because nobody knows whether it's good or bad and all the rest of it. And you've only got to look at, Harry Potter 1, the Philosopher's Stone, and it's a huge book. And more importantly, it's created a chunk of following, and as almost everybody who's read book 1 has read all the way to book 8. So there are instances, and I must admit, I didn't explicitly say English only as a language. I left that floating.
Right.
So I'm not quite sure how much of the answer I got is corrupted by not limiting the language. But when I take, admittedly, doing a search in English, a huge proportion of the papers are significantly Chinese only in terms of authors. And even when they're not, there is still a large proportion of Chinese co-authors in papers written based out of the US, Europe, and the rest of the English world. And my normal search would not pick up a Chinese language paper. So I'm wondering how long it takes that rather stuffy traditional market to shift. But it went electronic, not quite overnight, but pretty damn close. Going from, my 1980s only on paper science citation indexes issued monthly, reincorporated quarterly, and then bound as a hardback, multiple Bible size, large format telephone directory on an annual basis. That was a huge cost. Whereas having a database, it's like all the international standards. I used to have to carry around 3 or 4 bankers' boxes of paperwork to do my day-to-day job. And the last time I worried about carrying it around, it was a wallet of like 120 CDs, and it was US, European, UK, Australian, the lot, and kept up to date for me by they read, because scripting meant that every 3 or 4 months you got a new set of discs. Now it's just online.
Yeah.
I don't even bother carrying. I just carry the laptop.
Right. Right. And just
Um,
make sure you've got
but
internet access
if there
wherever you
was a
end up.
limit
Yeah.
Well, it's like it's the bigger
of,
thing
of,
is
of that model, um, and the other one I was going to ask, partly in amongst Chris put in about the Tyndale Bible being in English. Given the like 200 years or so later, the revolution in France, we were talking
Hmm.
about the way the church flip-flops and changed there. They clearly were having the Bible in French by then. But what was the literacy rate? I mean, I see here Muslims who can't read, but they can, using Chris's dynamic tricks and all the rest of it, they can recite quite happy whole huge chunks of the Quran
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they learn, as opposed to here's how to read because you could then read other things.
Mm-hmm.
But he's they open the book. They don't get taught how to read. They get taught how to chant that step. Um, and it
Yeah.
quirks. There's a story about how um, Europeans, particularly, having no real language, no real understanding of Arabic, how some of the Versailles World War One negotiations went. So you had some of the Arabs had European advisors, one of whom was T.E. Lawrence,
Mm-hmm.
and one of his customers of advice just sat and he translated real time that the Arab was saying literally was just reading the story from the Quran. And T.E. Lawrence was saying these are the demands of the people of the Levant and etc. They want their freedom from the Ottoman Empire, etc. And
Right.
Lawrence had to disappear from the conference because his father died.
Mm.
So Gertrude Bell took over the translation for the group. And when the conversation restarted, she just turned around and said, "You don't need me. XYZ fight, Prince Faisal here speaks perfect English."
Right.
And so dropped Faisal in it. But not knowing the language of your religious text and or not knowing the language of the conversation can be quite a problem occasionally. Harry, back to the book or anybody else.
well,
Yeah. One
oh, go
one
ahead, Cubs.
one thing to note with just sort of the um, people reciting the Quran verbatim, that also happens in evangelical churches because there are competitions at youth camps for memorizing large chunks of the Bible, and they will just sit and like they'll throw a quote out and you have to say where it's from, but then also do like recite a whole book of the Bible. Just and they're like, and you will win a prize. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, there I know have some good friends who had memorized verbatim 20 to 25 books of the Bible, and they could just sit and just spit the whole thing out. And you could stop them and say, what chapter, verse,
Fahrenheit
and they could knock it
451.
out.
Yeah.
And I was just like, holy crud. And I tried playing along with that game, and there are still some things that are stuck in my head. I'm like, I will hear something, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, had picked up James, and like there are some things where I'm like, things will trigger. I'm like, crud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like, it sticks.
Yeah.
But it's not just a thing with the Quran, it's also with the Bible as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it was the background for it was if the books go away and they take our Bibles away, we will still know
Mhm.
what the Bible says.
Yep.
And that it happens today still.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even, when I was in the open educational resource world,
Mm, yeah.
LibreText, which I found out only because they had scooped my open
Hmm.
textbook, and because when they scraped the internet, they got mine as well, and I found it there, and so I contacted them and said, yeah, it is, Creative Commons licensed, but
Yeah.
you still have to, the attribution is a thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So so you are supposed to, to like let people know. But he went out of his way, Delmar, for the longest time, and I don't know if he still does, but he was actually
Hmm.
producing a thing with a huge, piece of originally flash, memory in
Hmm.
the center that you could send to, the remotest village in, sub-Saharan Africa, and people could have, the world of knowledge at their
Hmm.
fingertips, kind of thing, because he was acutely aware that, that not all of us had this same access to, infinite amounts of free broadband. But yeah, it is, the whole thing is interesting because those that makes, um and one of the things to kind of go back to the whole religion thing as a
Hmm.
as a, as a sort of a prototype of a siren server. One of the other things that I responded to this week was, Brett Weinstein, making this argument about how, I think it was on Dad Saves America, and that guy he's a Catholic, sort of new Catholic, and believes that, that everybody should be, I guess. But Weinstein's perspective, or his point was that, and he kind of went into some detail about his difference of opinion with Dawkins on the,
Hmm.
kind of Weinstein seems to believe that the way that culture evolves is identical to and uses a lot of the same processes as genetic selection. Right. And so, and that allows him to kind of go another step and say that, well, then religion is adaptive, right? Because,
Hmm.
which I think is problematic, and there are several gaps, I think, in the reasoning, which I am gonna, spend some time and try to expand on. Um, but one of the things that strikes me is this whole thing that we were talking about earlier about communities, right? Chris, when you were talking about the early church again, you were talking about, so this community, and protecting, orphans and widows and things like that. And doing a lot of these things, and that it was the community, the other members of the community, that actually did it under sort of this umbrella of, the share, the religious
Well,
that
that's
so the question in my mind was, are the tenets of the religion actually relevant, or is it the community that the religion produces, regardless of whether its tenets are net positive or net negative? Simply the creation of a community is potentially the the thing that turns the
well,
dial in terms of survival and reproductive.
Well, it's
when
where
when you
where
when you
you
and
look at
Chris
where
mentioned that.
you look at where the value is created and where does that value redound to in small pieces. So, if we look at Tim's example of the publishing industry, the author is doing the vast bulk of the work.
Mhm.
And in modern American publishing, if you go to a big publisher as a brand new author, let's say you wrote a fiction book, you're going to get roughly 7% of the value of the whole thing. And
Mhm.
all the rest of the value, and that's essentially, even if you've got a good agent, you'll be lucky to get 7%, maybe
Mhm.
slightly better if you're super famous for some reason.
Mhm.
Um, but 90+% is going to go to the publisher who's doing all the rest of the work of the printing, the distribution, they say they pick up marketing, but the amount of marketing that an average publisher does for a new book is pretty much nil. In
Right.
fact, they rely on the agent and the author to go out if you're a new author,
Right.
and you spend 3 grand, 1,500 to 3 grand a month as an individual to hire a publicist to try and get you
Right.
on Oprah or all the TikToks or whatever that thing is.
Right.
Um,
And
which
yet
is why
Yacht claims that they delivered the eyeballs.
and then they say that they did the work.
Right.
But what and that's why most publishers would prefer to have somebody who already has a platform, which is
Hmm.
why how many TikTok followers you have, how big an audience do you have on YouTube, how big an audience, because then it makes it a whole lot easier if you're Ryan Reynolds and you just put out a new book about your experiences on, Deadpool or whatever that is. It's going to be super easy for you to get attention and eyeballs for every interviewer on the planet because
Right.
you've already got the platform and you're going to sell whatever. So every TV show who needs to fill time, except for maybe Jimmy Kimmel this week, is going to book you on their show because you're going to fill the thing and make them money.
Hmm.
Um, but the publisher is taking all the value. Now you you write it once and you make a couple thousand, and you have to be a full-time writer,
Right.
really pumping it out and killing yourself to make a minimum wage living as a writer in America today, because most
Hmm.
of the value is really going to the publishers or someone else somewhere else. The value is not going into your pocketbook. And he talks about this, I think, in the framework of the music business in some
Yep.
of the early chapters, that you have to be touring and touring full time. And sure, there are Taylor Swifts who are winning everything because they are at the right place, the right time, and do it. But the average Joe Blow musician really cannot make a living
Right.
as a musician. Or the average author, the middle of the distribution curve really can't make a living doing that because all the value goes to somewhere else. Similarly, for universities,
Hmm.
they provide a space, or even the studio system is set up roughly exactly like the university. If you look at
Hmm.
the economics of what they're doing and how they're doing it, and individual producers, writers, and directors are bringing incremental value in and leaving a huge amount of value on the table that the studio swoops up, or that the university swipes up, or that Elsevier in the publishing industry is scraping off the table and keeping. But
Yep.
a lot of universities are realizing, hey, we're spending so much on subscription fees for Elsevier.
Yep.
We could take that money and instead add 2 or 3 positions in the library.
Hmm.
They can archive it, save it. The academic themselves is doing all the work, and in fact they're even doing the peer review piece and the
Hmm.
editing
Right.
down to the nth degree. All
Right.
that value is being done by people already in our system, so why don't we just keep that value, add a few more people for the archiving in the long term, and the big mission of most libraries is to archive that stuff long term anyway.
Hmm.
So let's just keep that value inside and we can spread
Hmm.
it out through the university system as a whole rather than giving it all this money on an annual basis to Elsevier. And we'll become this our own siren server, and the university as a thing takes that additional value for themselves. So you may disintermediate the big publishing companies from doing that. But then the issue too is the university, a lot of their value and input is educating students or getting research grant money from the US government, which is not giving research grant money anymore. So there's a huge shift in academia in the next 10 years to figure out how do we maintain the value we've been building up since the 11th century
Hmm.
when the idea of the university started. And even then, when university first started, you weren't, as a professor, it was incumbent upon you to bring your own students in and charge them fees.
Right.
And the university wasn't even doing that piece at that point.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but that's how they started their Siren server is we'll bring the professors in, we'll give you some space. And then ultimately they also had to then start bringing in the students, which further then locks the professor out of the value of what they're doing.
Right.
And then the professor, when they die, they're just another cog in the wheel that can be replaced and now be replaced. So, who my friend Saul Galam was probably making $250,000 or more a year and was the senior most tenured professor at USC.
Hmm.
Um, he dies, and they can break up his salary and go hire
Hmm.
five adjunct associate professors, whatever,
Right.
who are then, and they're also going to be churning out a lot more academic work and teaching a lot more students than Saul ever did.
Hmm.
So, but all that value then stays with the university and not with the individual professor who's doing the work on a day-to-day basis. And it's
Hmm.
a whole lot easier for an individual human being to short sell themselves and leave money or value to something else to come in and scoop it up. The
Hmm.
same way, if you're a taxi cab driver, there's kind of an even split between the taxi cab company you work for and yourself. But when Uber comes in and they scoop up all the value and they leave, I was particularly struck in the section of where does the entropy lie that he talks about? Like, don't let Uber take on any of the risk. All the risk for being knifed or stabbed or having issues or dealing with, regulations. The individual driver has to do that.
Hmm.
And almost no Uber driver has a plastic partition between the back seat of their car and the front seat of their car, which almost every taxi cab did
Sure.
because the taxi cab company and individual governments proactively said, you need to do this. And Uber realizes, oh, we can take all of that money and value and put it in our pocket and let the driver take all the
Accept
risk.
all the risk. Yep. So there's no
You know,
liability. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then there's no liability to us when they get stabbed by the person that they picked up,
Yep.
you know.
Yep.
So,
And that's the thing is that so much of this is, I mean, and that's why I think there's so little empathy or sympathy as these disruptions happen and as these people get, disintermediated and kind of put out
Hmm.
of business is because the perception is, and not wrongly in a lot of cases, that so much of the actual, not only the day-to-day practices, but the actual structure has been built on this kind of um, ripping people off, shafting people, by
yeah.
way of, having having this caste system. I mean, and the University of California, of course, is especially egregious in its caste system for faculty. But yeah, just that they're, that.
Well, and once you're stuck in that siren server, it's hard to get that money and value back out. So if you think
Yeah.
about it, we
Hmm.
could say patriarchy is a siren server.
Hmm.
And in early parts of patriarchy, there was some value in women giving up the day-to-day value of running a household, raising kids, preparing meals, doing all the work, which now every, you go to the far Christian right who say, Taylor Swift should submit to her husband. Well, fuck that. She doesn't need her husband to
Hmm.
live her life and do it. It needs to be a pure, you know, partnership back and forth because they love each other and she can keep doing what she's doing. She doesn't need to quit her day job. And in fact, actually, it's probably better for both of them if she doesn't quit her day job because his day job has a shelf life and
Hmm.
he's stuck, unless he finds another job thereter as an announcer or podcaster or whatever he wants to do. But she can keep making music for the next 40 years and, have a industry bigger than Madonna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but when
Right.
we look at the pandemic, a lot of women were given money or benefits that essentially paid them for their day job of running the household, raising the kids, and keeping
Yeah.
things afloat
For the first time.
because their husbands
Hmm.
couldn't go to work or lost their jobs or something happened.
Hmm.
But I know at least I've seen examples of at least 20 women who were running $1 million plus companies who left their day jobs making money or shut down their companies with 10, 20 employees because their husband, who was unemployed, could not make meals, could not do the laundry, could not get the kids to school, which to me is just total stupidity. Like you just flushed your whole family well-being down the toilet because as a man you couldn't step up and help out so that your wife
But
could keep the
obviously,
company.
Which in
they
almost all cases
obviously,
has got to be that instance of I did as shitty as I could at this job, so I would never be asked to do it again.
Yeah, but I have more or less, but it's that kind of thing that all the value redounds to the patriarchy because the women are doing the work for free. It's
Hmm.
unacknowledged, it's generally underappreciated, but it's at the end of the day, it's work. The same way,
Right.
like you have healthcare workers who go into people's houses and watch the elderly or infirm or check on them or move running around nursing daycare.
Hmm.
They're being paid peanuts,
Hmm.
but it's
but
because they do
on,
that, or because teachers are watching your kids at school all day, not only educating them, but then allowing you as a parent to go to work to make a living.
Absolutely.
That's essentially free babysitting,
Hmm.
and we're paying them a pittance to do it
Hmm.
instead of, this $200 billion that's going to ICE and DHS.
Right.
Yeah, imagine what the American economy would look like if you dumped all that money into the educational system, even if
Hmm.
nothing but to take kids off the streets and give them somewhere to go.
Hmm.
Like huge, huge value built up. But the problem is that value does not redound. It could redound to society as a whole or the US as an economy and a country.
if
But
you
because
put
it
that
can't go
money,
to a siren server whose name is Donald J. Trump, well, screw that.
if
We'll
you put
send it
if
somewhere
you
else.
put all that money back into the education system using the one book they understand, you'd still have 30 million daddies who can't control the kids, do the washing up,
Yeah.
etc. So I don't know what you're going to waste it for. You need Elon to sort that out, right? But if you go back, you mentioned about the early church being the source of the early healthcare system. And Dan mentioned it as well. And I think what was missing in that section of the conversation is what did it replace? It replaced the extended family, i.e., the immediate community. And now, of course, to make money, we all go and buy our own house at sort of somewhere between 18 and 25 because we're expected to leave the extended family. Therefore, grandparents, particularly, are no longer for healthcare, especially for childcare, especially doing it for free, maybe. But I'm now paying for the house. I'm now the key bread owner. They're enabling that work, so therefore they get to stay rent free. But and that, of course, comes up all the way through Graeber's work and various other bits and pieces we've touched on. But it hasn't seemingly come up through here. Yeah, you know, Graeber's bullshit jobs might well be ought to be the next title.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, it would have been interesting to see what he would have said about employment after the lockdowns. Yeah, the thing do we want to talk at all about this interlude, the sixth interlude that you called attention to, I think Thomas earlier, the pocket protector and the saffron robe.
Yeah, that I really like that and the Tim Nelson. Um, and it was just there's an awful lot within sort of the pocket protector and the saffron robe. Would there's a whole lot more there, and it is sort of like one of the small pieces that is sort of missing in sort of technosocial, uh, like cultural uh, writing, just about Silicon Valley and technology, because it's sort of spiders in different ways. One is people sort of that mindset of, there's a lot of different sort of mindsets that make up like Silicon Valley um, culture, and sort of the Indian culture comes in and brings along with it sort of what he was calling out with Jobs and just sort of how he functions, but also like an awful lot of the people documenting in like the early 80s, mid 80s, they were pointing to Jobs deriving an awful lot of his style from Est, which Lanier also brings up.
Mhm.
Um, and that I find sort of interesting, but there's also sort of this meditation and calmness and focus. Um, and then you just have like large influx beginning in sort of the late 90s with H-1B visas
Mhm.
and people from India coming in and doing an awful lot of the technical work and then taking over leadership, and a lot of them with background from IIT and degrees from there. And so it's just it was an interesting, it felt like it was sort of not a fork, but it was sort of a tangent off to from where Linear had been pointing, and then sort of going in a slightly different direction.
Mhm.
Um, and it was a section that I was like, I realized that there isn't a whole lot of writing on this. There's an awful lot of sort of hippies culture, counterculture, which that chapter sort of ties into, but it's a piece that doesn't get called out that much.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I just found it really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was like a different tone, different sort of aspect. I'm like, I started thinking like of all the books that I have about just sort of technosocial culture. I'm like, I don't have anything that like really touches on this all that much.
Right. Yeah, well, it's interesting too because there's that chaos book, that sort of connects that came out recently that sort of
Yeah.
connects Manson with MK Ultra. But,
Huh.
so the whole, so there's nowadays, or at least in the last year or so since that book has come out, and people have, to whatever extent they've agreed with that thesis, right? There's a potential dark side to this thing that typically we would have thought of as, as kind of positive, right? The sort of
Hmm.
expanded consciousness world of even like Timothy Leary
Hmm.
and that sort of thing. But also, kind of very boomer culture, right?
Hmm.
That this generation is the center. This is is the focus. Is very self-absorbed, but also is very skeptical of authority, right?
Hmm.
Which is an interesting kind of a tension there, right? Between
Hmm.
the internet, being this DARPA project, and then you've got these,
Yep.
these kind of these people who are working with it and subverting it or claiming that they're subverting it. Um, Also, there's, I mean, and the people who become, the billionaires
Hmm.
initially, right? I mean, some of them are nuts. So, I mean, who's the guy who's the paranoid guy? McAfee, right? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but then the next and there's probably a story about a generational shift too, because because that's not Zuckerberg.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It.
And it's not Chamath either. I mean, he's just an immigrant
Yeah.
kid,
Yeah.
put his nose to the grindstone. Not
Yeah.
probably not Elon either. I don't know
Mm-mm.
about Teal. I don't know his background.
It's. Um. Yeah. I don't think there's much in that. Um. And so it's just, yeah, there's a large divergence sort of with that crowd. And have gotten into some discussions with friends who are, you know, sort of senior engineers, but then also VCs,
Uh-huh.
and sort of along these lines, and just sort of different leadership styles. And those that, in the, 80s, you still had the, uh, sort of the tales of the 1970s and transcendental meditation, which largely was, thanks to the Beatles sort of
Uh-huh.
introducing that, and sort of, and just sort of West Coast, um, culture just sort of glomming onto things to the West as much as to the East. And also just sort of, uh, the immigrant populations that were sort of natural or common on the West Coast that were just not on the East Coast,
Yeah.
and just sort of cultures intermixing and blending, and sort of having that come up. But just sort of the background of, thanks for the book, Chris. But it's having the cultures blend, but then also just sort of having the sort of the teal, the South African influenced teal sax, Elon, that had all come out of South Africa
Oh,
with,
is Teal from there too? Okay, I didn't.
yeah, he studied there in sort of a very conservative white school that hated America. Like,
Mm,
all of them had that. They didn't like America because America was pushing to remove apartheid. And they're just
right.
like, we need to destroy apartheid. And that was really strong in the late 80s.
Uh-huh.
And so it's just like some of the things that are done, I'm like, if you take it from that perspective, and it's just like, okay, a lot of this kind of makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Um, but they they don't have sort of that West Coast cross-cultural looking, East meets West. But then you have sort of the other side where you've got sort of the new leadership taking over Microsoft, Google, and you have sort of a blend of, you have people who are from Asia and Asia subcontinent, and those mindsets and those cultural backgrounds sort of blending into Western. And then you have sort of the Western that had bled into Eastern. And
Uh-huh.
but then there's sort of the outside that are just, which is a really small pocket, sort of the teal Elon, and that pocket is a really small portion of sort of Silicon Valley, framing, and just sort of, how people think, how people perceive things, and just sort of how they move forward.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it's just, and then you sort of have Zuckerberg, who I don't know that he has a mooring, as much, because he seems to drift, and sort of Facebook sort of drifts, and just sort of the groups that just sort of float in, sort of take control of it, run things for a bit, and then they sort of spin out, and another group comes in, with a different mindset. And so
Uh,
it's,
it, it kind of makes me wonder too about Thiel's idea that you don't need to go to university to do things and be successful. But the thing you miss if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you're ensconced in computer code and technology and maybe you're good at math, but you're a little on the maybe a lot on the spectrum, but
mhm.
Maybe a lot.
you totally miss all the humanities and
Yeah,
the big questions of how should I live my life? What's a
yep,
good way to live my life? What's
yep,
the moral way to live my life? Which at least somebody like
mm,
Steve Jobs was exposed to, was interested in, thought about, and even applied things as simple as the artwork of how to do calligraphy
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and use that as a thing to inform which font styles you're going to build into your computer system that
Yep.
Hmm.
almost no other tech person thinks about or cares about those subtle humanitarian or
Yep.
humanistic, not
Right.
humanitarian, humanistic things to like
Yep.
inject into what you're doing.
Hmm.
But Teal sees and realizes and probably knows and has at least some humanities background to be able to say, yes, if I can divorce you from the morality as a multi-billionaire who's going to invest in your company, I can get you to do all kinds of immoral things that are not
Mm-hmm.
good for society, but that put money in my pocket,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
he's been very successful at doing.
Mm-hmm.
You look at his portfolio, once he made his fuck you money, he's been able to invest that fuck you money into all kinds of things to make even, you know, way more fuck you money,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and give himself way an outsized influence in American politics,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
well, is
of
you know,
which he
it
did
kind of
not.
so Peter Thiel versus Larry Ellison, right? I mean, Palantir is I mean, I think we know what Palantir is, right?
Yep.
But do we know what Oracle is?
It that really I have done advising to top tiers at Oracle in the past, and they know it's like their databases are good. Their applications are relatively poor and really not well thought through and built. Um, it was just and had some very, my nature is sometimes being very blunt and just sort of calling things out as they are, which people that were senior VP and then became president at Oracle, and then I think one of them took over CEO role for a short bit. But it's just like they're like, we like your take on things, and just because they just weren't getting somebody who was being blunt,
Hmm.
and they're like, oh, Oracle, we want your money, and they're just like, we need to figure out how to work you in, but you run very counter to what we believe, and I'm like, what do you believe? And
Yeah.
they couldn't really answer it. And it was just like sitting with like, was usually at various conferences, they'd pull me aside. They're like, oh, we're going to lunch. I'm like, okay. And like sitting with three or four of the senior VPs from Oracle and just having, interesting conversation. And they're like, we need to like turn our ship. And they're like, you're calling out things that are really problematic for us. And we know are problematic, but we don't have many other people calling them out. And they're like, we need, and the other people who are calling it out don't know what the other path is. They just know that they are problems. And they're like, you see the other path.
Mm.
But they're like, it would be highly disruptive and we can't figure out quite how to do that. I'm like, that's fine, whatever.
Mhm.
Um,
Well,
and it's like,
they were first on the turf, right? They planted their flag, and then they
yeah,
had tons and tons of inertia.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
they made their money in databases and then they started, you know, pulling into applications that were heavy database reliant
Mhm.
and sort of built their tendrils out on that, but they didn't understand the applications nor the domains that those applications were in, like finance, um, all sorts of other stuff. And like if companies that went to Oracle for their finance, you needed to change how your company worked in order to use Oracle's finance product.
It's
And
almost
that was detrimental to companies.
right. That's almost the metaphor of, you know, you're an IBM shop, right?
Yeah.
Back in
yeah.
the day,
Yep.
right? You know,
Or well, the tough part is that once you've built your siren server,
Yep.
it's very difficult to build the second one or evolve into a new iteration. So
Yep.
yeah, and you see Mark Zuckerberg flailing around like he's got Facebook is the thing,
Yeah.
Mhm.
but now he's thinking, hey, what's the next thing? What do we do next? Where do we
Yeah.
go? Do I make this meta thing? Do we get into AI? Do we get into what's the next? And he doesn't know what that next thing is, which is a very hard
Mhm.
Yep.
versus someone like uh you have Bill at Microsoft. makes billions of dollars and amasses huge personal wealth,
Hmm.
and Microsoft doesn't know where to go next, but they're doing what Google is doing, and they're making small bets in other areas to see what might pay off.
Yeah.
And lately, everybody is kind of dumping money, huge money into AI as, oh, maybe this is the thing. And if it does pay off, the one or two first players that are there that can manage to create the next siren server in that space is really what
Yeah.
they're trying to do.
Uh-huh.
But Bill at his age is like, it's so much easier. I can retire and take my billions and try and, quote unquote, do some good in the world.
Which
So
which has
he,
Yeah.
managed somehow, ironically, to double his billions.
but well, it's easier to make more money when you've got money.
Yeah.
But what you watch what he's done is he has extracted small amounts of massive wealth by extracting small amounts from other people doing the work using
Mhm.
his product.
Yep.
Hmm.
And he is now turning around, and instead of had his company been taxed in a democratic government used that massive wealth to improve society as a whole would have been a better option. But instead, he's now got this personal wealth that he's trying to actively decide. He gets to personally decide, I'm going to put money into water in Africa or this or that, whatever. I'm going to put it into education.
Uh-huh.
But he's also now forcing those things down the throats of those places and societies that may not want them. Maybe they need them, but they may not want his particular solution, but they don't have the power because he's walking in with the person. And he's actively caused a lot of problems in places where he's shown up and
Uh-huh.
literally just wasted huge swaths of money trying to get things to improve in cultures that don't see him or get him or understand the solutions he's trying to hand,
Hmm.
which is a whole nother thing. So you build up this massive wealth and then you dissipate big chunks of it in poor manners because you just don't know how to do that. And he's never been trained to do that. It's just, oh, I have a lot of money and so I'm going to get to do what I want to do with it. And there would have been way better ways for a government to have taxed that money away from him and used it for better societal good,
Uh-huh.
you know.
Well, and
We're
now,
obviously not we're not in that regime right now. Hopefully
right,
things shift.
right. Just that the one thing that you said along the way just kind of struck me when you said there, everybody's building out, everybody's buying NVIDIA, um, you know, right now,
Hmm.
building out data centers. This is like, I mean, remember in the 90s, remember WorldCom?
Oh
Remember
yeah.
all the fiber that was laid?
Yeah.
Are we seeing is history rhyming here or what's going on? I mean, if we don't
It,
get the payoff,
yeah.
even if we don't get it fast enough from the expectations, that are being put on language models and generative AI generally, how long a rope do they have?
They're already getting challenged just with like Apple Silicon and just sort of the ARM chip architecture is is able to exceed what NVIDIA is doing.
Uh-huh.
Um, you know, that ARM architecture for chips and just like is a heck of a lot cheaper, can run faster and more efficiently than what NVIDIA is doing. And NVIDIA has been sort of now playing catch up, but they have the brand around NVIDIA and sort of because they're market darlings,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
um, they have they have that sort of traction, and there's an organization around it or sort of a siren server forming maybe around it, but it isn't the leader right now. They're playing catch up, but
Uh-huh.
there isn't anything formed around ARM chips formally because of
Yeah.
the nature that it's more or less open.
Right.
And so it's just I
Right, but
think there
it's like a log
there is
curve
a
though, right? So
yeah,
it's sort of topped off on the log curve,
yeah,
but the growth is still, sort of up and to
yeah,
the right on the basic graph. So people are
yeah,
still kind of being sucked in.
yeah. They're growing. Yeah, they're definitely still growing, but there's others who are catching up, and it is sort of it's like an open source model that it has sort of caught on and then spidered, and then the tendrils of that have gone ahead of it, but it is the one that everybody can point to, and just, other than like Apple Silicon, nobody else really can call out, you know, there's like, you know, a handful of other sort of small open source ARM chip makers.
Mhm.
And what Apple had done of buying up all the capacity for various like 3 nanometer, 5 nanometer chip manufacturers,
Mhm.
nobody else could enter that game. And they had bought up like 2 to 3 years of capacity out, and which sort of makes it difficult for others building ARM chips to be able to do the same thing unless they're able to, build their own factories, which, takes a couple of years to do that.
But also forces that supply chain, and it's very similar, I think, to his supply chain analogy with Walmart. But the chips that are being made because they bought out all the supply and the capacity are chips that are specific to their architecture, which Apple was always very big on doing their own architecture versus IBM compatible architecture,
Right.
which then further pushes everyone into their ecosystem if that's the only thing that works. And at the same, you see the same things even with the little, you know, lightning, dongles, or
Mhm.
what's the dongle of the day. Hey, we can literally create an entire, business on matching our dongles that we're going to choose to put into our products and shift the entirety, whether or not this particular dongle, is USB-C that much better than A or B, or what does it add to or detract from? But hey, we can literally shift $1 billion worth of market value just by changing the form factor, you know.
And make you buy it again.
And then you've got to, yeah, you have all these materials in your house, but we'll make you buy all the things again. And would it have been that hard
Well,
to,
right.
shoehorn the same form factor versus changing it and making an entirely new form factor, but just with one or two, because all it's doing is changing the configuration of the leads, and maybe
Hmm.
it's adding one extra lead for one extra functionality. So why not create a form factor right now that has 15 extra leads on it for the next 50 years, and that form factor is there, and you can add to it over time, and
Yeah.
do it instead of forcing the world to spend billions of dollars on all these wires and cables that are just going to hit a landfill within 5 years.
I'm going to do a large and tie it to Ted Nelson, which
Nice.
is you don't need you don't need as much infrastructure if there's only one version and you're not making copies.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And like reading through the Ted Nelson chapter, I keep on forgetting how much of my DNA in understanding and just sort of digital philosophy and information theory is oddly grounded in Ted Nelson. And
Mm.
it's just, I find it really funny because I've got a concept that I've used in just sort of like enterprise and like large organization consulting and advising, and which is, I had written it up in 2014, which is small apps loosely joined, where essentially if you've got a standard document type, like iCal or Markdown or other things, you can have many different applications reading that information that specialize in doing something specific with it.
Mhm.
And it makes it easy so that, I could go from, and it was sort of why I shifted away from Scrivener to just plain Markdown. And I've gone through many different Markdown editors over time. And my notes start in Obsidian, which, you know, is the overlord and watches over all of my Markdown files.
Mhm.
But I'll start a note in there, and it may start looking like it's something that I'm writing. So I'll add a blog fodder tag to it, and then I'll pick it up and start working on it in AI Writer
Uh-huh.
to do a more formal piece, and then I'll pull it into another app to do a light check on links, other things. And then I take that same markdown file and drop it into marked two, and then go through it, pull some things out of it, and it maps directly to all the scripts that I was running, you know, 10 years ago before I started using marked and doing the HTML markup. And doing all the IDs and everything for headers, and doing all the uh, turning curly, straight quotes into curly quotes, all sorts of different things, and doing it properly. And then I take that and drop it into my blog, still using my homegrown blogging tool, CMS, that I wrote in 2000.
Wow.
Drop it into that and, hit publish, add some categories to it and so forth. But
Well,
it's just
I
that
noticed this.
those
Yeah.
small apps have functions, and it's all around that core piece. There is only one copy of it, essentially, until it gets to, my output,
Well,
and I have to do some changes.
they just added a new thing in Core Obsidian this week called Bases, which I haven't
Yeah,
played around with yet, that
yeah,
essentially gives you database functionality, which is
yep,
really what it is your text files are a massive database of information.
yeah,
But that being
yeah.
said, I want to take Lanier to task here because at the beginning of chapter 18, I he I I think he's making too much of a hero about Ted Nelson and his ideas. And surely he influenced some
Yep.
things and reformed how we think about them. But even in that second paragraph where he's talking about mashups as a new thing, we all know, having played and looked at the history of information and data over centuries, even in the Anne Blair, people were doing these things for centuries. They were extracting pieces of information, um, and then reusing them, rewriting them, putting them into new things for
Uh-huh.
ages. And when he shows up and uses words like intertwingle, which really are, you know,
He was hot.
or or Vannevar Bush using the phrase, Memex, when literally I guarantee you within 20 feet of his office, somebody had a mem index on their desk
Uh-huh.
within three office spaces of his office in the 1940s. Like these were really not new things, but they were creating new phrases and new infrastructure to use those same things. It's still a wheel and you're still putting it on a car. You're just, you know, reforming what the car does or how many seats it has. But I don't think all of this stuff is as new as some people with still, and I think Lanier here has the same kind of rose-colored tech glasses that everyone was wearing in that early 2000s wired period where it's all fun and joy and not Bill Joy. Um, so I don't he doesn't get me to buy into that because I know better, but
Uh-huh.
he's also the people who are reading this are probably very assuredly not asking
Hmm.
those questions and going along for the same ride that technology has been riding for the last, century almost. And we need to be very, very careful about how we do that, particularly
Hmm.
when we're almost about to get into his solution for how we should be doing things.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, it's just yeah, it's Sibaldoni, right?
Hmm.
It's all this, it's all these things that have been done, forever, and were done before, before there was writing, by people, in their epic poems, or, or their megalithic structures, or whatever, being rethought in a new medium.
Yeah. I mean, when there's literally the Latin word ars exerpendi, like, just because Jaron Lanier doesn't read Latin and know what that is, doesn't mean it didn't exist for several centuries,
Yeah, yeah,
Cicero was doing this.
yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think the core idea in this first chapter on Nelson, right, is the single copy, right, which I think we all like, sounds like. Although
Hmm.
the single copy idea has its limitations too, right? I mean,
Right.
I now have, in my big master, 2025 master is what I call my biggest vault. And within it, I've got a bunch of folders, right? And and the vault for the Obsidian book club is a folder. And the text that I'm writing now for Ancient Medieval World is also a folder that I have been reproducing stuff
Hmm.
into, right? And so
Hmm.
sometimes, so sometimes when I'm on the way, because I do pretty much all of the writing in hypothesis no, not hypothesis in Obsidian, Thomas, unlike what the workflow that you were talking about. And
Hmm.
I will even ultimately kind of publish it out to my students as
Cool.
an Obsidian publish instance.
Cool.
So so there are multiple. I guess I don't know if I'm expressing this right, but I'm thinking of these things as almost being duplicates.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
or I'll duplicate something and then I'll continue to edit it, right?
Yeah.
There's and my kind of my OCD mind is saying go, you can't have two. Go back and you got to
Yep.
do something with that, eliminate that other thing. You don't need
Yep.
it anymore, and then I'm thinking, well, do I or don't I? Or
Yep.
and storage is cheap, and that was that was their big downfall, right? Was that,
Yep.
that bandwidth was expensive, storage was cheap. It
Yep.
was it was great for Seagate.
Yeah. I was going through that this week because I had stumbled into the design studio that did the AR digital design for Swan Song, which I really, really have a strong affinity for. And was writing it. It started as a note in Obsidian, then it turned into its own note. And then when I got it into HTML, I had a ton of backlinks, double brackets.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, okay, I got to remove those. And I'm like, I'll replace those with links to Wikipedia pages for background. And I'm like, okay, my HTML version is now a cousin of my note, but it's essentially still the same. And I ended up catching a couple edits in HTML. I'm like, okay, that I need to bring back into my note. And I'm like, it, it's one of the things that I always have a tension with, and I'm fine living with tensions. Um, but it's just I would like to have them the same. And it's like I use, for academic articles, things that have high relevance, I will throw them into Devon Think and as a PDF, as a continuous single page. And then I will also take it and throw it a PDF into Dropbox, into a reading folder, because then I can pick up that and annotate it, and I can pick it up on iPad or anything and use it. But that gets my notes and annotations and marginalia from what's in Dropbox and my reading sync that I also pull into Obsidian. It is then sort of separate from a clean version that is in DevonThink.
Mm,
But then I can tether them back because I'll have a cross link between them.
uh-huh,
But it it's that sort of I'm continually trying to figure out how to have them self heal
uh-huh.
and pull into one while still remaining having a clean copy used for really good search in DevonThink, and then also still having my marked up and annotated, more messy version.
Yeah.
That's the problem is having your own server where all your data lives and is usable from one single source in place
Yeah.
versus, and I think there's a lot of information overwhelm people have because they're using 47 different digital services and
Yeah.
all of their data is not in one place. So it becomes a question of, oh, do I need to search for that in my Gmail account or do I need to search for that in my Microsoft Photos or oh, maybe it was in my Flickr account that I had it. You have
Right.
to remember where the thing was,
Yep.
and you can't even search your own data well, much less search well for all the data.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But one of the things that strikes me
It-
too in this particular chapter that so a lot of people may give short shrift to is he talks about links and bidirectionality or not.
hmm
In the
Uh-huh.
early internet, it was a lot easier to say, oh, we don't need that, so we'll just write HTML without it.
Uh-huh.
But it now exists as a thing, and I'm waiting to see how long it takes to get to use scale. But there is now a small amount of code, and all of it's free and open source that you can add web mention technology to your website or to your server so that you can create bidirectional links. And, he talks about Google's scraping the whole web so they can create those bidirectional links
hmm
internally for themselves, in which case all the value then goes to Google because they've built that for themselves.
hmm
But that now exists as a thing you can put on your own individual server that
Yeah.
you're running for, 50 or a couple $100 a year
Uh-huh.
that and the example I use often because it happened years ago, and he didn't support the technology, but I wrote a blog post about note taking or something, and Andy Matushak used my thing as a reference and wrote about it in his, online notes.
hmm
And because someone clicked on it, and I had at the time ref backs, I still do, set up on my website, I get a notification that somebody clicked on his link and came to my website. And I get the referrer traffic to say where they came from to show up to my
Cool.
site.
Hmm.
And then I can use that to I clicked a button literally to force the web mention to happen on my end, but it
Uh-huh.
then means his note repository can talk to my note repository, and there are bidirectional links from my site to his and his to mine
Yeah.
now.
Uh-huh.
And if he deletes his, I can, if it's set up or you have them working properly, the person who deletes theirs and says a web mention that says I deleted it
Yeah.
should delete from your side as well, and then it's just gone.
Uh-huh.
But I'm curious to see how that starts to happen as more and more servers. The only big, what I might call a siren server, but I think he's designed it specifically not to be, is Manton Reese's micro.blog.
Yeah.
Works as a social media platform the way most people would use Twitter or Facebook, but it's specifically designed in the background to not be those things, or at least
Yeah.
not to have the toxic pieces that those do, and he's not using it for those reasons. But he supports web mention, so I can post something on my website. You can read it on micro.blog and comment there, but my site will pick up your comment.
Hmm.
We can have a two-way conversation between two totally separate servers running totally separate code,
Uh-huh.
but do it in a way that preferences my server for me
hmm
and his server for him, or essentially he's renting server space to you if you're a user on it. But we
Uh-huh.
can have a two-way conversation,
Yeah.
and you're just choosing to use his server as a service, whereas I choose to run my own server.
Uh-huh.
Um, but there's a huge amount of value in me for that with the people that I interact with in those ways.
Uh-huh.
The issue is there aren't enough there. We haven't seen people reach scale running those types of servers, or things like in 2016, Garon decided I'm actively going to not support web mention for Mastodon
Huh.
because the user's expectation isn't that the data will leave our servers and go somewhere else because it just wasn't common. So it didn't seem like a thing that, and he could have built it in within a day or less than a day, and that would have not only it would have massively shifted the Fediverse into a broader, everybody could own their own server and talk back and forth at will. But he decided for whatever reason or reasons not to support that. And I think it was a UI user expectation thing. But I think the Fediverse could massively have a sea change if they decided to support things like that, that would just dramatically suck all the oxygen away from the Twitters and the Facebooks and make, a more human-centric web with that technology. So I agree with Lanier that it's valuable, but even though it exists in the world now, I don't see it having reached scale that value is being realized.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And I'm curious how it dovetails in with the rest of his thesis towards the end of the book.
Yeah. Okay, so in the negotiation, Tim has suggested that we go all the way through the seventh interlude. So then we'll have just a kind of a race to the finish the following week. Is that good?
Can do that.
All right. Cool.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. There's going to be a lot of links to follow in this one.
Oh, this stuff is so dense. It's,
Yep.
we
Yep.
could have spent 2 hours just on one chapter here, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Have a good week
All
then.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.
Enjoy.